Hello everybody and welcome back to another beautiful adventure of A&P with Perkall from home. Dun dun dun. Okay, as you can tell, I may be going a little crazy, but you have no idea how bad it's actually gotten. I mean, things are with the natives have gotten really ridiculous, so you don't even know what's going on. I mean, there's dogs pushing around and it's gone completely insane here. But we need to get back to talking about school and things like that. And so we're going to start off by talking about the heart again, right? That's where we were. And the heart should make you happy. And there's lots of different kinds of heart, right? You can have the heart of a warrior, which, warriors with great heart can do many, many things. But what we're really going to wind up talking about is actually the physiology of the heart. And my dog wants to come visit. Say hello, Shadow. So the heart physiology, when we're talking about this, and this is sort of where we left off, so we're talking about the changes in pressure that causes valves open and shut. Those valves open and shut actually wind up leading to the sounds that we hear. But the process of changing the pressure was due to depolarizations of cells, and the depolarizations of certain cells cause the contractile cells to contract, which is actually what's changing the pressure. But grand scheme of things, what we're talking about, what we really want to do is the heart is a pump. Right? So we want to pump things out of the heart. Well, the amount of blood that we pump out is actually can vary. And so and what we talk about when we're talking about blood actually leaving the heart, we're talking about cardiac output. Now, cardiac output is defined as the amount of blood that we pump out of each ventricle in 1 minute. Okay, now it turns out that it's even. Like, both ventricles will pump the same amount of blood out. That way the heart doesn't get backed up in any form or fashion. But when we're kind of in general discussions, usually cardiac output, we're trying to think about it in the sense of what's being pumped out to the systemic. And most of the discussions, most of the examples we give are examples where we're talking about the left ventricle of the heart pumping things out to the systemic side of the body, the systemic circuit. Cardiac output is dependent on two things. If you think about it as the amount of blood pumped out of the heart, in 1 minute, then you're really talking about the idea that, like, okay, how many beats are there per minute, right? That's one component of this. And then how much is each beat pumping out? Those two components are called stroke volume and heart rate. And stroke volume we saw before is basically the difference in the end diastolic volume, the amount of blood that is actually filled into the heart, minus the amount of blood that's in the heart after the heart is beaten, which is the ESV, in systolic volume. Okay, so stroke volume is really the EDV minus ESV. Heart rate is simply a rate, so it's beats per minute, right? And so when you talk about the amount of blood that you discharge in an entire minute, it's going to be the number of beats that you have in a minute times the amount of blood that's ejected each time. Right, so that's cardiac output is equal to the stroke volume times the heart rate. Now remember, stroke volume is really just EDV minus the ESV, so you really could just kind of use this equation here. And that's probably the equation you would rather use, and I'll show you why much later on in this lecture, but you'll see. Now normal heart rate is around 75 beats per minute, and normal stroke volume is using around 70 milliliters per stroke. And if you do the math on that, that winds up giving you about 5 some odd liters that you're pumping out of your heart every minute. If you remember from lab, that's about how much blood you have in your body. So you're literally pumping your entire blood volume throughout your body every single minute. The cardiac output really can vary drastically. Now, in a healthy individual, when nothing's going on, it's going to stay the same. It's going to be very constant. But it can change when you exercise, when you start moving around, when you do things. I mean, cardiac output can go up to 5 times the normal, 20 to 25 liters per minute. And that's in somebody who's not athletic. If you've been working out and training, it can go up to like 35 liters per minute. That's a drastic increase, a 7-fold increase in this pumping rate. Now, there is a difference, that difference between what your cardiac output is normal, the resting cardiac output, and the maximal cardiac output is what's known as cardiac reserve. It's basically the reserve, the amount your heart could be pumping if everything was going like it should. Another thing to point out here before we leave cardiac output is the idea that cardiac output is directly proportional to the stroke volume and the heart rate. So if you want to change either one of, if you wanted to change cardiac output, you could just change those. Things that would increase those, if it's directly proportional, increasing stroke volume, increasing heart rate, would increase cardiac output. If you decrease either of those, decreasing stroke volume or decreasing heart rate, those would decrease cardiac output. So it means to be directly proportional. Okay, so those are going to be the important concepts, and that's what we're going to focus on, is how do we change stroke volume and how do we change heart rate, and in what ways does that wind up affecting, grand scheme of things, how does it really affect it? Now, we're going to start off with stroke volume. So if you start changing stroke volume, now one thing to point out is that each beat of the heart does not eject all the blood. Okay, it doesn't actually wind up leaving all the blood. Normally about 60% of the EDV is actually pumped out. Okay, so typical numbers are about 100. The ventricles will fill with 120 milliliters. That volume can change, obviously, if the diastole is longer, right? If it stays less contracted, more blood has a chance to flow in there, and that number could go up. The amount of blood coming back into the heart, what's known as venous return, that could go up, and both of those could cause EDV to go up. Both are possible. But average number is 120 milliliters. You usually eject about 40%, okay, and so wind up leaving yourself with about 50 milliliters. The systolic volume is about 50 milliliters, and so you leave that in the heart. Excuse me, it's the other way around. You leave 40%, but so you pump that blood out. It goes. That's the ESV is usually around 50 milliliters. That's determined by several different factors. One's the arterial blood pressure, right? You're going to have to be able to pump this blood out of valve. That valve closed because of the back pressure, so that pressure is going to affect it. And then how strong the ventricles are actually contracting is going to affect that. And you'll see that here in a few minutes. Now, there are three major concepts with stroke volume that you need to get. It's preload, contractility, and afterload. Now, they're all different, and they affect different parts of this. They're either going to affect ESV or EDV, right? And so that's the way to sort of think about these. And so when you're looking at the first one, we're going to start off with preload. We're going to work through these. But when you're looking at the first one, preload is really just the idea that you're stretching the myocardial fibers within the ventricles. Think about it. Blood comes back into the heart. The heart's got containers. Okay, now the heart's flexible a little bit, so you can stretch it. If you put more blood back in, it's going to stretch the heart more, just like a balloon, right? If we put a certain volume of water into a balloon, it's going to stretch a certain amount. We put more into it, it's going to stretch further. The heart works the same way. And the idea is that stretching actually winds up affecting how strongly the heart ventricles will contract. And that's called the Frank-Starling law of the heart, or Starling's law, one of the two. You can sort of, both are commonly used. But what literally happens is the cardiac muscle fibers are not like skeletal muscle fibers. Remember we talked about length tension relationship when we talked about skeletal muscle fibers, and that you really try to maintain that maximal length tension relationship to get the most power. For cardiac muscle tissue, it's actually maintained, a normal cardiac cell is maintained at a shorter distance, okay, so that you can increase the length of that muscle cell and still get an increase in the power of the contraction that you're going to wind up with. So, grand scheme of things, the thing that affects preload the most is venous return. Okay, it's going to be the most important. It's going to wind up stretching the heart. More blood gets back to the heart, more of the heart stretch. Think of the balloon. All right, we put more water in, more blood coming back, right? That's going to actually cause it to stretch more. That's going to wind up resulting in a higher EDV, right? Think more blood gets back in, that's a higher EDV, and that is going to wind up with like a greater preload. You're stretching those more. Now, one thing I do want to point out, you stretch the heart muscles too much, it's just like the length-tension relationship. There is a maximum. If you go too far, the sarcomeres aren't overlapping, you're going to have problems, okay? Now, preload, I like to think about preload with exercise because I think that helps the most. If you think about what's going on with the heart when you're exercising, you're pumping your muscles, you're running, you're doing whatever. The muscles themselves are actually squeezing on the veins, and they're pushing the blood back towards the heart faster. So venous return is going to go up. That increases your preload, right? That increases your cardiac output, which is a fantastic thing because you're running. Okay, it's a good thing to not to have to you're wanting to pump that stuff around, so it winds up balancing out fairly well. If you think about it, having a very slow heart rate is actually going to also wind up affecting the stretch of these fibers, increasing preload. Okay, because the ventricles are going to have longer to fill. Now, the converse is an issue here, because if the heart starts beating too rapidly, if you have tachycardia, you actually wind up not giving the heart enough time to fill, and you reduce preload, and that actually reduces cardiac output. There's lots of things that are going on here, but really, grand scheme of things, this preload idea is basically a way to maintain the idea that the amount of blood that gets into the heart is going to be about the amount that gets ejected. It's a fantastic system. The other two major factors are contractility and afterload. And contractility is actually a really interesting thing. Contractility is going to be the amount of force for a contraction at a given length, at a given preload. Okay, and the weight, so how strong can the muscle fiber contract? What is the force that it's able to generate? And it turns out that calcium winds up playing an important role here. Now think about the mechanism for muscle contractions. Calcium has to bind to something so the power stroke can occur. The more calcium's there, more power strokes can occur. The stronger the contraction, the stronger the force. And so anything that actually winds up increasing the calcium levels in the cytoplasm is going to increase contraction strength, and then therefore wind up increasing contractility. Now, there's several different things that will do that. Contractility can be increased by the sympathetic nervous system, the release of the epinephrine and norepinephrine, certain hormones like norepinephrine and epinephrine, and those thyroid hormones all will wind up increasing the contractility of the heart, the strength of the contraction of the heart. If it does that, it's called a positive inotropic agent. There's lots of different kinds of those. These are just a few examples of those. But anything that causes a greater strength of contraction, a greater force of contraction, those are positive inotropic chemicals. Negative inotropic agents are going to be things that decrease contractility. And any of those things are really going to be things that actually wind up interfering with the ability of the heart muscle to take up calcium in some form or fashion, or somehow interfere with the ability of the muscle cells themselves to contract. Okay, acidosis will do that. Rising extracellular potassium levels, calcium channel blockers, all those things will interfere with this calcium pulse, this increase of calcium that you're supposed to have in order to make this happen. This is an example of a positive inotropic chemical mechanism that they have. Now you can see there's norepinephrine in this case. Hush, Shallow. Norepinephrine, Shallow, hush. Sorry. She's barking at birds. The norepinephrine is going to bind to the beta-1 adrenergic receptor, okay, up here in the top left corner. Right? When it binds, it actually does what a lot of these things do. They initiate a G protein. In this case, it's a GS protein, a stimulatory G protein, that goes and activates adenylate cyclase. We've seen adenylate cyclase before. It takes ATP, pops off two of the phosphates, makes AMP, and then cyclizes it so that you get cyclic AMP. The cyclic AMP acts as a second messenger and goes and activates an inactive protein kinase and causes that protein kinase to become active. That kinase is going to do what kinases do. It phosphorylates things. And the phosphorylation of three different things actually affect the amount of calcium that's available. One thing it's going to do is going to phosphorylate plasma membrane calcium channels. It allows calcium, the extracellular calcium, to move in. That's going to be calcium that could be used for interacting with actin and myosin and causing the contraction to occur and be more forceful. It also can go and release calcium that's stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, okay, by opening calcium channels there. Those calcium channels, calcium ions, also can go in, do their thing, okay, do all that stuff. And lastly, and this may seem kind of the strangest, it actually winds up going and activating an enzyme, a calcium uptake pump on the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which will pull calcium in, okay, into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now that's important, right? You got to think about what heart muscles want to do. Right? They want to contract, relax, contract, relax. I'm dancing right now, you can't see it. Contract, relax. Aren't you glad? Contract, relax. That's what they want to do, right? They want to contract and relax, contract, relax, contract, relax. And that process of contracting and relaxing is going to requires calcium to be pulled back away. Remember the mechanisms that you see when you think about the way muscle contractions occur. That calcium has to be pulled away. It's the final trigger. It has to be pulled away so the cross bridges will stop so that relaxation can occur. And that plays a role. So just the norepinephrine, okay, binding to the beta-1 adrenergic receptors, initiates this cascade, secondary molecule, this cyclic AMP, secondary messenger, that eventually causes all these things to happen. It's a fantastic system. Okay, and that's how a lot of the positive inotropic ones would work. In the grand scheme of things, get more calcium in there, higher contractility. Afterload is another interesting thing, and afterload is the last thing that really affects stroke volume. And afterload is really the amount of force needed to open the semilunar valves. Now, if you think about it, the way those open is, remember the mechanism. The ventricles are going to be contracting, both of them, right and left ventricle are contracting. They have to build up enough force to open the semilunar valves, and the semilunar valves are closed due to back pressure, right? That's going on in the aorta and the pulmonary veins, okay, pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries, excuse me. Those vessels, okay, the pressure that's in those vessels differ, right? When for the systemic circuits, around 80 millimeters of mercury. For the pulmonary circuits, usually around 10. But it's still an amount of force needed. This is what you're doing. Afterload is the amount of force needed to actually push those open. There's not a lot of different types of things that really affect this, but there can be, right? Think about it, like people with hypertension, with high blood pressure, if you increase the arterial pressure in some sort of way, it's going to make it harder to open those valves. The blood pressure's higher, right? And that blood pressure's higher, that resting blood pressure's higher, means you have to push more forcefully. The heart has to contract more firmly to eject the same amount of blood. In other words, assuming nothing compensates, assuming the body doesn't compensate in any way, that's going to decrease the stroke volume, okay? And you wind up with a higher ESV in systolic volume because less blood comes out for the next heartbeat, okay? So that winds up being an issue, okay? And so you want to make sure you're kind of aware of the ways afterload winds up working. Now, honestly, in a healthy cardiovascular system, you don't have any problems. You don't have high blood pressure. You don't have any of the other things we're going to talk about a little bit later on. Stroke volumes, pretty much constant. Okay, if your blood volume drops, your heart is weakened in some way. It's not beating as firmly, as strongly, as forcefully as it could. Then that's going to affect stroke volume. How do you deal with that? You still want your cardiac output to be about the same, but remember, there was two components: there's heart rate and there was stroke volume. Okay, and so you can maintain cardiac output by increasing your heart rate. Okay, you can also increase contractility, make the heart beat more forcefully so that you actually do eject the blood. But that can wear on the heart and be dangerous. Okay, so just bump your heart rate up a little bit. Right, it's going to get the cardiac output back up to the same. That'll work great. Okay, and any factor that actually increases heart rate, we call positive chronotropic chemicals. Factors that decrease the heart rate are negative chronotropic. Okay. Now, the autonomic nervous system plays an important role in monitoring heart rate, and it's the most important extrinsic control. So from somewhere else, from extrinsic means outside of. It's the most extrinsic control over the heart rate, and it turns out the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system both innervate that part. Now, remember when we talked about the way this innervated the heart, the sympathetic nervous system innervates more parts. Innervates the SA node, the AV node, and the ventricles of the heart. Okay, so it can affect more components. It can affect contractility, whereas the parasympathetic division really only affects the pacemakers, the AV node and the SA node. Okay, and so those wind up being important, and that difference winds up being important. So how can the sympathetic nervous system affect it? Well, the sympathetic nervous system can actually work on the SA node, the depolarizing part. Right, the SA node are the non-contractile cells, the cardiac cells within the heart. It can work on those. It releases norepinephrine because that's what it does. When that norepinephrine attaches to beta-1 adrenergic receptors on the SA node, it actually increases their ability to depolarize. So they're able to depolarize faster. That's going to increase heart rate. Okay. It also enhances contractility by increasing calcium availability through the mechanism that we just saw, the picture that we just saw. That's what's going on there, which is good. You want to contract the heart more forcefully. That actually winds up lowering ESV, right, making more blood come out at the end of systolic volume. So that number's actually lower, and because if you think about it, if it doesn't do both of those, just increasing heart rate would just increase ESV because you wouldn't have as much filling time. Remember, just changing heart rate, boom, 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 from boom, 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 that's going to mean less time to fill in between the beats, right? So you actually have to beat more forcefully to get the same volume out. And so, hopefully that seems obvious that would be bad. The parasympathetic nervous system is actually the part of the autonomic nervous system that's most important. Because it has dual innervation at the SA and the AV node. The parasympathetic nervous system, it seems like these two are kind of fighting. The sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, it's almost like they're fighting. And it turns out that the dominant one is actually the parasympathetic nervous system. It's inhibitory, and it does so through the vagus nerve. And we talk about the heart having vagal tone. For all intents and purposes, your heart, if I were to cut your vagus nerve right now, your heart rate would suddenly jump up to about 100 beats per minute. Basically, your heart has a brake on it. Okay, you have something sitting on, basically your foot's riding the brake going down a hill, and the parasympathetic nervous system is the thing pushing the brake. Okay, so it can slow it down, and it does so through activating by releasing acetylcholine that hyperpolarizes the effector cells, causes an opening of potassium channels. Those potassium channels, the potassium ions actually flood in. It winds up hyperpolarizing cells, makes it harder for them to depolarize, and they depolarize at a slower rate. Okay, so grand scheme of things, that's the way that works. The autonomic nervous system also has to decide who's going to win, right? Like, you've got both of these parts in there, and they're fighting. Who wins, right? The way they do that is that the autonomic nervous system actually receives information from the body, and it does so through baroreceptors. Baroreceptors are like pressure receptors. They detect some sort of change in pressure, okay, and they do so from a couple different places. There's the aortic bodies and the carotid bodies, and the aorta and the carotid arteries, respectively, that are taking blood pressure, basically the pressure of the blood, taking monitoring of that, trying to figure out, okay, how much pressure is here, and can send that information back to the brain. The brain can initiate sympathetic or parasympathetic responses depending on what the pressure is. Right, it's too low. You want the blood pressure to go back up. Hey, let's have the sympathetic nervous system take over a little bit more. Hey, your blood pressure's too high. Maybe we need to lower the heart rate. Okay, let's lower the heart rate some because your blood pressure's too high, and the parasympathetic nervous system can do that. So all those things are possible. Now, there is one other thing that's important. There's what's known as the Bainbridge reflex or the atrial reflex, that can actually initiate kind of a closed loop system with the autonomic nervous system. Basically, the idea here is that the atria are filling too much. The atria start to stretch, and so venous return is really high. The atria are stretching. You want to clear that quicker. Okay, if there's lots of blood coming back in and you're actually stretching the atria, if you initiate the sympathetic nervous system, start increasing the heart rate, you're going to pump that blood through the atria quicker. Okay, so that's the idea there. You don't want the blood backing up. When it's trying to get into the atria are too full, it's backing up. You don't want that. You also want the same amount of blood to be leaving the heart that's coming in. Okay, so that reflex winds up being important in that. There are other things that regulate heart rate, though. Chemically, that was the neural side of this. There are chemicals that actually affect heart rate. Hormones are one of the big things that do that. You have epinephrine that increases the heart rate and the contractility. Remember, this is the same sort of chemical that's released. Epinephrine and norepinephrine both have similar effects on tissues of the heart. Thyroxine, which is remember that's T3, that increases heart rate if it's released in sufficient quantities. The main way it actually winds up acting is it enhances epinephrine and norepinephrine, the activity of those two chemicals, and it increases heart rate and contractility by allowing that to happen. There are other ions that actually wind up playing an important role in regulating heart. And really, you want an appropriate balance to get the appropriate heart rate. If you have too much calcium or too much potassium, those can wind up affecting things, causing things. Have too little, it causes things. So it sort of just depends on which one you're talking about. Hypocalcemia means having too little calcium. That's going to depress heart rate. Hopefully that's obvious because we talked about how calcium plays a role in contractility and all the other different things. Hypercalcemia is going to actually wind up increasing heart rate. Through the same sort of, if you sort of think about the mechanisms by which the heart rate, if you go back to heart rate, don't think about contractility right now, just think about heart rate. If you go back to how those the autorhythmic cells worked, calcium might have played an important role in that. Okay, so changing that calcium is going to affect heart rate. Hypokalemia or hyperkalemia has to do with potassium levels, and hence the letter K for potassium, right? It's because it's kalemia. And so the hypokalemia having not enough is actually going to cause the heart to beat weakly and irregularly. Hyperkalemia, both of those are very dangerous, by the way, but hyperkalemia can actually cause heart block or even possibly cardiac arrest. So neither one of those things sounds fun, so kind of want to avoid, you want to have the appropriate amount. There are other things that affect heart rate is your age. Turns out the speed of the heart in the fetus is extremely high. I remember that when we were first went to the doctor with Silas. He said his heart rate was 160. I'm like, dear God, what's wrong with him? Give him some medicine. He's a fetus. He can't handle it. But that's what it's supposed to be. Okay, I just was freaking out for no reason. Gender also seems to matter. Females tend to have a higher heart rate than males. The amount you exercise affects that. Okay, it's like the heart rate is affected by the amount of exercise. You have, the fight or flight response, synthetic activity is going to cause a higher heart rate. And so that affects heart rate. Heat will affect heart rate. Increase your metabolic. It actually increases the metabolic activity of the cells. Those cells are going to be able to contract more often. Okay, which is, you get a fever. A lot of the time your heart rate's elevated because of the fever. Cold does the opposite. It depresses heart rate. Okay, so because it basically literally does the opposite. It slows down the metabolic activity of the cells and blah, blah, blah. All right, so here's a nice little chart. Right, and these are all the different ways, all the things we just talked about, all the different ways you can increase cardiac output. And you can sit here and you can go from start at the exercise and talk about how exercising is going to cause increased venous return, which will cause an increase in preload, which is going to lead to higher EDVs, which is going to lead to higher stroke volume and higher cardiac output. Okay, and you can work your way through all those things. And you might be to the point to where you're like, but Perko, it's so hard. Which first, that's what she said. And second, this is just math. Okay, like literally, you don't have to make this harder than it needs to be. Why use the real numbers? Okay, I realize real numbers matter. Okay, whatever, and you can learn those real numbers, but just make up numbers. Okay, numbers you can do, easy things. I'll give you an example here. If you remember that the equation for this, cardiac output is equal to EDV minus ESV times heart rate. Okay, just put numbers in. I don't care which numbers. Pick numbers. Okay, cardiac output is equal to 5. The EDV is 5. ESV is 2. You multiply that times 3. Just because that's math I can do. 5 minus 2. 3. Silas can do that, man. Like, it's not hard. 3 times 3 is 3 sets of 3, which is 9. Okay, that is not hard to do. Okay, so cardiac output in that case would be 9. Well, what if there's some sort of situation that makes EDV go down? And you're like, no, I'm going to die. I want to just make it go down. Right, it used to be 5. Now it's 4. 4 minus 2 is 2 times 3 is 6. Cardiac output went down if EDV went down. This is not hard. Not if you use this equation. I promise you, use this. Use this to help you figure it out. Now, what factors will cause these to go up and to go down? Those vary, and you'll have to look into and think about that, and that's where the critical thinking side of this is. You got to think about, hey, if I were to increase, arterial pressure, which number does that affect, right? But that's something you can do. You can figure that out. Okay. Now there is a rule for this. You can't have zeros. Nothing can ever be 0. That doesn't work. You're dead if you have zeros, right? And also ESV always has to be less than EDV because, that's just anatomy. That's not possible. You can't contract and make something get smaller yet the volume go up. Okay. So just those are the 2 rules. Use those rules and you'll be fine. All right. Heart rate, homeostatic imbalances. If your heart's beating too fast, it's called tachycardia, right? That's when your heart's actually persistently above 100 beats per minute. Honestly, the reason this is bad is because when the heart's beating that fast, you're real likely to have a fibrillation, uncontrolled beating of the heart, and an unpatterned beating of the heart, which can be dangerous. Having tachycardia can be caused by lots of different things. Having a high body temperature, stress can cause it. There are certain drugs you take that will cause high heart rates, and then like cocaine and things you aren't supposed to be taking. And then heart disease can sometimes cause tachycardia as well. Bradycardia is actually a slower heart rate, less than 60 beats per minute, and it's not one of those things that you're like, oh my gosh, my heart rate's so low. Like the resting heart rate is, oh no, that's not that big a deal. It may not be a sign of disease. People who exercise oftentimes have a heart rate less than 60 beats per minute. Okay, a resting heart rate less than that. Because their heart's healthier, it has a higher stroke volume. So you don't have to beat as fast. Okay, the heart muscle, literally the walls of the heart have hypertrophied, it's stronger. You don't have to worry about it so much. Now, what can cause bradycardia? If it is something unnatural, well, it could be, low body temperature. There are certain drugs that will do this as well. Both it's prescribed and otherwise. And then, as well as the parasympathetic nervous system. One thing is that like sudden bradycardia can actually be a sign of brain edema, the brain swelling, and the pressure in the brain. The body's like, oh, no, don't pump so much blood, don't pump so much blood, and it slows the heart down. Okay, that's one thing that's going to happen there. One thing, if you're talking about homeostatic imbalances and cardiac output, one thing to point out is that cardiac output is usually balanced with venous return. That's the idea. If not, the blood winds up backing up in veins. Right? You want to have the amount of blood leaving the heart to be equal to the amount of blood coming back in. When something happens and there's an issue, congestive heart failure, which is a disease that actually is fairly common, which can be a problem. It's where the heart action is not strong enough. It's not, the pumping is not strong enough, and to manage tissue needs. Okay, now there's lots of things that happen here, but mainly the issue is that the myocardium gets weakened. Okay, how does the myocardium get weakened? Well, there's lots of different things. You could have coronary atherosclerosis. That's where fatty buildups occur within the heart vessels, the blood vessels of the heart itself, and that causes problems. You can also have persistently high blood pressure. Okay, persistently high blood pressure causes all sorts of issues, makes the heart going to have to beat more forcefully to open those valves. That's going to cause problems. Multiple MIs or having several different heart attacks kill the tissues, heart tissues. Those heart tissues, once they're dead, they don't regenerate. Fibrosis occurs very rapidly, and so you don't get contractility, you don't get strength, you don't get force of contractions, and that causes problems. You can also have an issue called dilated cardiomyopathy, which is not well understood what causes it. There's several different things we know could cause it. Again, cocaine, several other different things, drugs and stuff like that. Maybe disease, like where the heart's been infected, and it's kind of a side effect of that. But basically what happens is the ventricles wind up enlarging, so the ventricles get bigger. Once they're bigger, the walls, just basically the cavity of the ventricles get bigger. The walls of what isn't larger, and so they're not strong enough to actually pump the blood, and the heart just becomes very ineffective. Excuse me. There's two types of this. Two types of congestive heart failure. There's one that's pulmonary congestive heart failure and peripheral congested heart failure. Now, this is kind of backwards, and you got to think about this. But if you think about the heart as being two-sided, it pumps to two different circuits. One side of the heart could fail, whereas the other one doesn't. And when one side fails, it affects what the other side can do, because remember, you're pumping into two different circuits. You want the amount of blood going into one circuit to equal the amount of blood coming back, because the one circuit, like think about it, the pulmonary circuit empties back into the part of the pump that's going to pump to the systemic circuit. Okay, so they affect each other. So pulmonary congestion, yes, the right side of the heart actually is what beats to the lungs, but when the left side of the heart fails, okay, failure of that causes pulmonary congestion. Literally, the left side's not pumping out fast enough, and the blood starts to back up into the pulmonary veins. These veins aren't used to having high pressure, and it damages them. Okay, and it winds up making it very difficult on those veins, and that elevated pressure in those veins causes a lot of different problems. One of the major problems that happens there is that the pressure actually winds up starting to filter the fluid out. So fluid starts to actually leave those blood vessels. Those blood vessels are not made to handle high pressure. And so it's like a hose is leaking. Think about a hose, like if you backed up pressure in the hose and the hose had a weak spot on it, that fluid would start coming out of that weak spot. That's what's happening here. It's backflowing. You're having this flow move back out, and fluid actually winds up building up in the cavity. Remember where these vessels are? They're in the same cavity, the pleural cavities, as the lungs are, right? And so that fluid starts to build up. It pushes on the lungs. People actually suffocate. Okay? It's very difficult for these people to actually breathe without treatment. Peripheral congestion is caused by a failure at the right side of the heart. So the right side of the heart's not pumping the blood out quick enough. It's starting to back up into the systemic vein. That winds up leading to edema in the peripheral parts of the body, the fingers, the feet, that sort of thing, swelling there. And it just causes issues. What happens here is that this is when the heart, when this issue causes heart decompensation. Okay, there's a problem there. And you can deal with it. A heart that's been decompensated can be dealt with. One way to do that is you reduce the fluids around the heart by giving them diuretics. Right? The diuretics make an individual pee out more fluids. Right? More fluids come out, and then the fluid from the lungs can be reabsorbed, and it doesn't cause as much pressure. You can also lower the blood pressure. Okay, give people drugs that actually will lower the blood pressure. Lowering the blood pressure is going to actually reduce afterload. The heart can pump less forcefully to pump as much blood out. It'll pump blood through it more quickly, hopefully, and it will reduce this problem. And then the other thing is you can actually give digitalis or other stimulants that are going to make the cardiac muscle actually beat more forcefully, more strong, forceful contractions. Okay? Now, hey, that's it. We finished the material. Everything that you need to know, you now have. Your exam, it's still soon, okay? So please be studying. Please watch this. Please go over it. Please email me with questions or chat with me or do whatever you want to do to try to get in touch with me so that we can get your questions answered. Still have the study session the night before the exam and everything else, and so hopefully I'll help you out. But, yay! Yes!